All right, we're back and with another guest. Right now, we are just going to introduce her as Eileen, and we're just going to mention that she is zooming in with us from a site that is not her typical place where she would be talking Fitzgerald, but she's actually on vacation, and you can see a little of the vacation background there in her screenshot. Eileen, how are you doing today?
Just fine.
Good, good. Well, I am going to go to the screen and you are going to give us 3 clues to figure out your connection to Fitzgerald. So here we go. Number 1.
Okay, the first is Montgomery to Montgomery.
That's pretty tricky. I am in Montgomery, but I know you are not here in Montgomery with me. So Montgomery to Montgomery. Number 2.
Okay. Number 2 is tender is, quote, the brown unsettled earth.
Wow,
tender is the brown unsettled earth.
That one's really tricky because tender takes place for the most part in Europe. And I don't believe there's a Montgomery, France, the last time I checked. Number 3.
Turning the family key loose.
Gosh, I don't know. I'm pretty stumped, Eileen. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us your connection to what famous Fitzgerald site?
Okay, my name is Eileen McGuckian. I am a historian, not a Fitzgerald historian, but a historian of Rockville, Maryland. And he had a lifelong connection to Rockville, Maryland. So I'd like to tell you about that.
Great.
So these are some pictures of the Rockville, Maryland that he knew. So he was born in 1896. He was born in St. Paul and came to Rockville in the summers to visit his father's family. His father, Edward Fitzgerald, was born in 1853, grew up on a farm, well, probably about 10 miles away from Rockville, but still considered generally the Rockville area. And Rockville is the county seat of Montgomery County, Maryland. And it's a crossroads community. And by the 1920s, it had 1,400 people who lived there. And once you got outside of Rockville, you got onto roads that mostly were unpaved, but beginning to be paved, farmland all around. Throughout Montgomery County, there are little main streets, and this is Rockville's main street that shows up in the picture. But pretty much you're talking about a courthouse town with businesses and very much, I think you could describe it as, and people did, as a slow Southern town. So Southern that we had our Confederate statue, which Fitzgerald knew. So if you look at the picture in the lower right, you will see a statue in the very middle of the picture, and it's right in the front of the courthouse, right on the main street, where all 2 of the public buildings are at that point. And of course, all 2 of them. And of course, he's facing south.
Okay.
So Scott Fitzgerald went to visit his grandfather's family his father's family, in Maryland during the summers. And it was a great place for a kid to grow up. His father apparently was a wonderful storyteller. And I think having been a teenager when the Civil War came to Maryland, every year during the Civil War, there was an invasion of Confederate forces of one sort or another. And his father told wonderful stories. And I think that very much inspired F. Scott, and it got his imagination going. So he was certainly full of that. We know he was in Rockville a couple of very specific times. The first one we can document was as a very young, probably chubby little boy holding the ring because he was the ring bearer for his cousin Cecilia's wedding. In Rockville. Today, it would be right near a subway station. Back then, it was off of a country road and near a community called Randolph and Montrose, and a train going by. But that's where it was a home wedding, and he was the ring bearer for the wedding. So he kept in touch with Cecilia all of his life. He kept in touch with Rockville and his father's family very much all of his life. So if you go to the next slide, we can look at a little more specifically. His dad's family were Roman Catholic. They oriented to St. Mary's Parish and St. Mary's Church in Rockville. This church is still standing, although this is a 1930s photograph of it at the top, and it's the oldest continuously used religious building in Rockville, and one of the oldest in our county. At the time, and still, it is at the junction of two major roads. People often were going through Rockville more than they were going to Rockville. So people would pass by St. Mary's, and it was very much known. His father's family came to St. Mary's, used the churchyard there for burials. But when Montgomery County got a little more populated, after the Civil War, they started worshiping at St. Rose of Lima, which is still standing as well. I don't have a photograph of this here. But down below, you see St. Mary's inside. It holds comfortably about 100 people down below, and then there's a choir loft up above, but it's basically one rectangular small country chapel. But this is where he came when he would visit the cemetery with his parents or his father's family in the summers. And this is where he came in 1931. Now, Fitzgerald left St. Paul, went to Princeton, went into the Army, met Zelda. They had their only child, Scotty, soon after. He's writing. They are going all over Europe and various places in the United States, trying to find a cure for what was ailing her. And so they lived in many places and visited many places to get a doctor's advice and so on. So they didn't spend a whole lot of time in Rockville during then, although they were in Baltimore in the 30s, looking for a cure for her at Shepherd Pratt Sanitarium. So by 1931, 1931 is when his father passes away, and he comes back for the funeral. That's pretty well documented. And so when I give tours of St. Mary's, I point to the front pews, and you know that F. Scott Fitzgerald was sitting where one of you happens to be sitting today. So that's kind of fun to imagine yourself with the family in the front pews. But he was also writing at the time, and one of the books that he was, the products that he was working on became Tender as the Night, which was published a few years after that. And in it, I sort of get goosebumps when I think about him describing Dick Divers, one of his characters in Tender as the Night. And he's just attended his father's funeral, and he's back to his old home territory, and he sees this tender brown earth, and he says, "Goodbye, my father. Goodbye, all my fathers."
A beautiful line. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty line. So that's St. Mary's, and then in the rest of the 30s, again, they're living in various places looking for cures for Zelda. Scotty is growing up in boarding schools and eventually going away to college. By 1935, he's not so popular as he was. It's the Depression. He needs money. He's not. He does have people who are helping to get his stories in and helping to support his family, but he needs money. So he is after getting into his mother's estate because he knows that he and his sister are going to be heirs, the sole heirs to his mother's estate, and he's wanting to borrow some of that money. His mother by then has had a stroke, and she's institutionalized, and she's in a psychiatric institution in Rockville. It's called Chestnut Lodge Sanitarium, which was world famous at the time and was until it closed at the end of the 20th century. And so she is there Whether he's visiting there, we're not sure. We don't have any documentation from that, but he certainly is writing to the people there. And he's also engaging an attorney that he knows from their days in Baltimore. And the attorney's name happens to be Edgar Allan Poe Jr. So his attorney, Edgar Allan Poe Jr., is petitioning the court, and these are some of the documents and the descriptions that he's making. He's saying that he has to, on the letter on the left, he's writing to a friend and saying that Poe says that I must appear in my stocking feet at the Rockville courthouse at 2:00 next Monday, the 27th. We don't think he actually appeared, and it wouldn't have done any good anyway. The court said she's still alive. It is her money. It may be needed for her care, and they lost the case. So his mother that was 1935. She did live until the next year and passed away. And then, of course, the estate was settled at that time. So you see a picture of Fitzgerald as he's still, that's, on a cold weather day in the 1930s, he ends up going out to Hollywood. And on the right-hand side, you see the Fitzgerald family section of St. Mary's Cemetery in Rockville. And on the left-hand side is his mother, Mary McQuillan, known as Molly Fitzgerald, and his father on the right-hand side. So we'll come back to that graveyard in a couple of minutes.
Right.
So he is in Hollywood. He is he's supporting Scotty in school. He's supporting in Zelda in institutions in various places, and he's trying to earn some money. Hollywood seems to be a good place to start writing screenplays and getting to know people out there. He is living with Sheila Graham, who I grew up knowing as a gossip columnist, but she's out in Hollywood, and they have a thing going out there. And he's in his 40s. He has a life to live, but it's a pretty high flying life. And in December of 1940, at age 40, he has what is listed as a heart attack and dies suddenly. Sheila Graham is distraught, doesn't know what to do. Who has a will at age 44 and knows what to do? So she talks to his college friend, who is now a judge in New Jersey, and the college friend makes all the detailed arrangements from there. He notifies the funeral homes, Pumphrey's Funeral Home. He notifies Rockville, St. Mary's. We're not sure what happened in there. There are no records that say that he was not allowed into St. Mary's. He was a lapsed Catholic. There is no question about that. He was writing blasphemous books. So he could have been kept out of that cemetery for those reasons, but there's no record of that having been done. Some people think that was sort of done quietly. He ended up being sent, his body being sent to the wrong Pumphrey's Funeral Home. By the 1930s, there was one in Bethesda near us, and there was one still remaining in Rockville. He was sent to the wrong one, but he did have, and this is the one in Rockville, and you see the hearse in front of it. And he also was buried at Rockville Cemetery, which is a cemetery that goes back in our town to the 1730s. It goes back to an Episcopal chapel of ease that was there that became a community cemetery in the 1880s, and burials were going on there along there in family plots at that time. So they found the Episcopal priest, Father Black, who had been there about 3 months, a young man, and he agreed to conduct the service. The family purchased a plot. Number 698 is the sales receipt for it up there on the right on December 26th, and it cost a whole $40. And it was the east half of the Harding lot. And Harding happens, I'll show you a picture of that lot later. John Harding happens to have the oldest gravestone in this cemetery. So they purchased half of that lot. And there gathered on December 27th were about 30 people, some people who had Matthew Perkins, a neighbor from Baltimore near Shepherd Pratt. Scotty was there with a couple of Scottish college friends. And about 30 people in total came to pay homage to him, and he was buried there.
Right.
So go ahead. So you can see the some other pictures of what nearby Rockville Cemetery in the these are modern photographs of it, but the picture on the left was taken after 1948 when Zelda died in a fire, unexpectedly, suddenly, disastrously in North Carolina, and was buried next to him. And there's some wonderful letters from Scotty saying how pleased that she was that that Zelda's family allowed her to be buried with Scott in Rockville, and how important that would have been to both of them. You can see the Harding grave that is highlighted in yellow behind the F. Scott's burial sites in Zelda's there. And that's the way it looked from 1940 to 1975. Now, I came to Rockville in the 1960s, and I'd pull up to Rockville Cemetery, and I'd sort of hesitate a minute, and a little kid would come running out of the caretaker's cottage, and he'd say, "For a quarter, I'll let you know where it is. I'll take you to where it is." And he never said what it was. I never said what it was, but I handed him a quarter, and he took me right to the Fitzgerald grave. So it was definitely a place where people came. And
That's a great story. And I was just going to mention to folks watching that three of our most famous Fitzgerald scholars in 1970, Jim West, Bryant Mangum, and Rick Anderson, came out to Rockville Cemetery and had that same experience with the caretaker's child that led them to the grave. And Bryant wrote a wonderful essay about it that we'll post a link to in the chat so folks can see that.
Okay, well, that happened to a lot of us, and that's how we got to know him. And then in 1975, everyone is getting excited about the bicentennial, and the Women's Club in Rockville approached Scotty, who was living in Georgetown at the time, and wanted to beautify the area around the Fitzgerald's grave. And Scotty said, I'm not sure my father would want to stay in Rockville Cemetery. I'm sure he would prefer to be with his family members, his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, his aunts and uncles and cousins in St. Mary's Cemetery. And they found a writing of his that said, I wouldn't mind if in a few years Zelda and I could snuggle up together under a stone in some old graveyard here. Now, where here is under debate between the Baltimore folks and the Rockville folks, but we think it's under an oak tree in Rockville, and that's what was his really happy thought, and not melancholy at all. So so with Scotty, the Women's Club, and the Civic Advisory Improvement Committee of Rockville, by then a town that was no longer the 1,400 people who lived there when Scott knew it, but by the 1970s, we had some 50,000 people. After World War II, there was a big influx of people into Washington, D.C. and its suburbs. And Rockville's always had that connection on the big road to Washington, D.C., even though it predates Washington. So they moved Scott and Zelda in the middle of the night, and then the next day there was a ceremony called Tender is the Day, and that was the program from Tender is the Day. And that, of course, is the key to the tender, one of the keys to the tender. So here is what you see today. You can see Rockville is built up quite a bit in the background. We went through urban renewal, unfortunately, and lost that main street that Scott and Zelda knew. So we've got a different background, but St. Mary's is still there at that major intersection. And when you go there, you can see 5 generations of the Fitzgerald family. When I go, I take a sheet that shows who are the 5 generations, and people fan out and find them. You'll notice that the same gravestone, the gravestone was moved along with the bodies, and you can see that almost in the foreground. When Scotty passed away, or actually when she was diagnosed with cancer in the mid-1980s, she approached the Monsignor at St. Mary's and said, can you accept one more Fitzgerald in your graveyard? And they decided that of course they could. So she was buried there in 1986 when she passed away, right to the foreground of her parents. So almost, I think everyone you see in there and in the next picture are going to be Fitzgerald, because there are 14 graves. So here's another shot looking from another direction. And you can see the parents in the foreground, aunts and uncles, great-grandparents. Their names are Scotts and Robertson and Fitzgerald and Key. But you can see Fitzgerald's, Scott, Zelda, and Scotty in the middle of the picture there. I think there's maybe, okay. I guess go back one, please, if you will,
sure.
Kirk. The decorations on the grave are always there during the year, when classes come up to visit, when people do their literary tourism, for his birthday on September 24th. So you'll often see pens and bottles of booze and pennies and writing tablets and different kinds of things. So, okay. So in 1996, the centennial of F. Scott Fitzgerald's birth, the preservation group Peerless Rockville and the city of Rockville and Montgomery College and St. Mary's got together and did 14 events for that year that were related to Fitzgerald. Several of them were at St. Mary's. But one of the things that has lasted, or two of the things I should say, the tour has lasted. We do that every year around his birthday. But the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Conference was born. And the idea was to combine a writer's workshops with speakers talking about writing, and then to honor a major American author. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And in those first years, probably in the first 10 to 15 years of that, there were people who knew Fitzgerald, not only related to him, but who knew him. And one of the people who came was his last secretary when he was in Hollywood. And she described how he would write out his writing, and she would type it up in triple space. He would take that transcript and he would write between the triple space lines. She'd go back and she'd retype the whole thing again. And how exciting it was to be there with a known author. So go on to the next. And these are some of the major American authors that we've honored since 1996. William Styron was the first one. And there have been all sorts of people who, poets and authors in their, very much in their own right. Garrison Keillor was really happy to be here for what he called the Omega. He was in St. Paul for the Alpha, and he was in Rockville for the Omega for Fitzgerald, but all sorts of scholars. And they've always come to the grave and paid homage to that. And okay, so, and I give the tour every year. So here's some bottles closed up, and the graveyard close up, and there we are in St. Mary's again. And I call the tour visiting Fitzgerald's haunts in Rockville. We go on a bus and we stop by the courthouse, and we stop by Chestnut Lodge Sanitarium and the 2 graveyards, and go through a little bit of Rockville. And this, I think this is the very last one. Okay. Again, some close-ups, and sometimes people get creative with what they leave, but flowers and bottles and things like that. And so the talk is going to be given again this year. Last year it was virtual, and this describes it. So we did a PowerPoint of it and gave it virtually. I'm hoping that this year on October 30th, we'll be able to get in the bus again and go around all of those places and find Rockville and Fitzgerald again in the 1920s through the 1940s through today. He's very much appreciated.
And we should say that if folks are interested in the conference, it's absolutely great conference. You can go to www.fscottfestival.org.
Stop there. Yeah, go to that general website.
That'll tell
Yes.
you everything you need to know. I think this year's honoree is John Edgar Wideman, so it'll be a very exciting event. So Eileen, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. And I appreciate you taking time out of your vacation to speak with us. And is there a kind of book or anything that if I were coming to Rockville on my own, that you would recommend that I get a copy of that might be able to take me on these itineraries that you talk about?
Well, I'd go to Peerless Rockville, which is the local historic preservation group, and they're located in the red brick courthouse that you saw in an early photograph in one of these slides. And they have copies of my history of Rockville, which starts in the 1730s, and when it's goes all the way through to 2001 when it was published. And of course, there's a section there on F. Scott Fitzgerald and his connection to Rockville. And then we have a booklet also that's just called F. Scott Fitzgerald's Rockville in the 1920s. And it's just taking a point in time and looking at the Rockville that he knew. And then it does mention those. It's a booklet. It's been out of print, but they have copies of it there. And if you're there with Kirk, I will take you on a tour. But contact Fearless, and Rockville Cemetery is very much a community cemetery. F. Scott would have loved a Civil War tour of Rockville Cemetery. We do that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and have fun in the course. I wish I were there. All those places.